So we're starting. There we go. I got it.
Got it.
We're starting a new unit on this foundations curriculum. This one's on ethics. And we're going to be looking at two different Jewish ethical levels. One is, what is our ethical obligation to all human beings, and one could argue all creatures as well as human beings. And the second, which we'll do next week, is, and it's called covenantal ethics, is what are our obligations to specifically the Jewish people? And the third week, we're going to look at where they conflict and how do we balance that conflict. When there's an issue dealing with humanity and an issue dealing with Jewish ethics, specifically particular ethics dealing with Judaism. And how do you balance it? And much of the Talmud and the Mishnah is really trying to figure out, how do you balance ethical and moral issues, religious issues, legal issues when they conflict? Because nothing is simple and nothing is pure. Everything always has a sense of balance. Like we've been and continue to wrestle with the issue of what does it mean to be a citizen of the United States? You know, in the Constitution, it was very narrow, right? So it was land-holding, white, male, mostly Protestant, different kind of Protestants. Though there were, in Rhode Island, there were some Catholics and some other places. There were Jews here. And ultimately Jews were considered citizens. Still was yet to be determined how we would be treated equal. Women clearly were not in that category. African American, Native American were not considered in those categories. And then over time, we've continually revisited the issue of citizenship and what it means. And part of that now is still being debated and argued in the right to vote, right? I mean, those are still aspects of how do we play out our citizenship? What do we give? You know, for instance, in a place like Australia, if you don't vote, you're fined by the government. You're required to vote.
Oh.
Required to vote, and if not, you receive a fine, penalty, right? Because they don't believe it should be a free choice, whether you vote or not. They believe it's mandatory. And we clearly as a country have not moved in that direction, right? We, in fact, sometimes, all the Jim Crow laws made it virtually impossible for African Americans to vote, as well as others. So the same is true with Judaism. There are issues that are there, but they have conflicting definitions of them, and they have evolved over time. So today we'll be looking at these issues of universal ethics. Ethics, what is it that we owe ethically to humanity, particularly? So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to take a look. Okay, that came up nicely.
Yes.
Oh, look at that. Wow. But I'm doing it well. Wait, I'm going to move you guys so I can see. Here, look at that. I'm doing this. Really impressed with myself right now.
I'm impressed. I'm impressed too, because I can't do it.
I haven't done this for a long time, and I was pretty rusty, but I'm getting there now. All right, so we look at source one. It's a very famous source. We all know it. It's not, any of it is not unknown to us. So who would like to read verses 27 and 28 from chapter?
I'll read.
I'll read.
And God created the human being in God's own image. In the image of God did God create it. male and female created God them.
Okay,
And God-
so let's start with
okay.
the first sentence. Let's unpack that.
Okay.
First of all, the word for human being is Adam, which also obviously we know becomes Adam, which is the male creation.
Right.
Here, because of the definition of male and female, which follows right after, it's understood that here it's a generic term. That all men are created equal could be understood and is today understood as men and women in our Constitution. In the Declaration of Independence, for instance, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, which today we understand as people, but in the beginning they understood it as only men, that they are endowed by their creator. So God has given us certain unalienable rights, and that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So that's our Constitution, which ostensibly is secular, but has God in there. The Creator has given us, according to our Declaration of Independence, the Creator has given us these rights. We would argue the same thing from a Jewish standpoint, because we say, as we just said, God created the human being in God's own image. In the image of God, God created it, the human being, male and female. God created them. So that line has come to mean in Jewish tradition that God created all human beings in the image of God, right? It's a very, very bold statement. It's very far-reaching. It means every human being. That means regardless of their status. So a human being who is enslaved is still created in the image of God. And that changes the way you would treat a slave. Because if you believe a slave is just a number or a non-human being, you can do whatever you want with that slave. But if that enslaved person is created in the image of God, when you mistreat a slave, you are in effect mistreating God. God's creation. So that's very powerful. And we could ask, we have a nice small class, so it's easy to ask this. So why did the Torah begin here? It's not our story, it's humanity's story. Why here? What do you think?
Well,
Gail, you just
when you say it's all people's story, the Torah, does the Gentile Bible start with the Torah?
Well, the Christian Bible does.
It does.
It starts with the stories in the Torah. They're told the same way because they call it the Old Testament.
Right.
Old Testament, if you were to read a Catholic Bible, would be the same chapter 1, verse 27.
And it would say the same thing.
Exactly the same.
So
if you were in the Quran, it would tell a similar story, but it tells it a bit differently. Yes, Rachel, you're going to say something?
No, I didn't realize that either. I'm glad Gail asked the question.
If you open up any Christian Bible, any denomination from any era, including going back to the Tyndale Bible, first one in English, you'll find that verse, same way it's here. Now, sometimes they translate it a little bit differently, but that's the word for word translation of the Hebrew. Okay, so that is also in the Christian Bibles in the same way. And so you can argue that they would say the same thing, though it's interesting that Christian Europe and Christian America managed to not carry it out with dark-skinned people. Not with Native Americans, not with African Americans enslaved, right? They didn't treat them B'Tselem Elohim. And we'll look at that in a minute because we're going to look at a little bit how the Torah deals with slavery. So Bobby, you want to do verse 28 now that I've expounded on one verse?
Sure. Sure. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and reign over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the heavens, and over every beast crawling upon the earth.
So now we're given a charge by God. This is the first commandment, right? Be fruitful and multiply. So don't be selfish and just think of yourself. Think of the continuity of humanity. Have children to follow after you. This is not your story alone. This is a story that will continue after you, and it should. This is a commandment God gives, and it's not given just to Jews. It's given to all of humanity, and saying it's your obligation to bring in new life and to pass off the baton, right? Now, we assume that, but one could argue, human beings could have been very satisfied not having others if they could have figured out how to stop it. Sex was also on the table, and because it's an urge, they're gonna have sex, and they didn't know how to stop having babies. So you could say maybe they had no choice. Babies just came, right? But fairly early on, they learned, how to kill babies. They could have done that. Well, I'm saying, there are animals that eat their young. There are fish that eat their young. It was possible that they could have made a different decision, but God here is saying, I want you to nurture a next generation. I want there to be following you more generations. And then it says, as you fill the earth, which means as you move throughout the earth. Remember, one of the things human beings did is they began to travel, right? Mm-hmm. From what we know, human beings seem to have begun in warm areas like Africa and some potential Asian areas in the south of Asia, but they didn't stay there. There were those that stayed, but there were those that trekked north. And they went to more inhospitable climates. But they adapted and they learned. And it seemed to be that human beings have this need to fill the earth, to move beyond where they are born and to explore. But it also says to subdue it.
Subdue it, right.
Which means to make it work for you. Right? And then it uses the word to reign over, right? To reign over the earth, the animals, the creatures of the earth. Now, so here we have now two levels of living beings. We have human beings created in the image of God, and we have the creatures that God created that we are to dominate, which will ultimately give us permission to eat them, right? Now, that's a development, but it will give us permission to eat them. Then the kosher laws will come in for Jews, but there's nothing about kosher laws here for humanity. Humanity is given the right to reign over all of the creatures of the world. So ethically, at this moment, we're seeing that we have obligations to treat human beings as created in the image of God. And we have the obligation to move beyond our borders, and we have the obligation to make earth serve our needs, and that includes all creatures. Yes, John.
So did that give, if you consider other races as beasts as opposed to human beings, is that how people, figured that they could have slaves?
So did you hear what Joni said?
No,
Yes.
No? Okay. So she was saying, did the people eventually interpret that the human beings they enslaved were not human, they were beasts, and therefore they could reign over them? And I would argue, no, that's not the way it happened. Christians, particularly, interpreted this as meaning, yes, human beings were created in the image of God, but after the story of Noah, God cursed certain human beings, Ham's children. And they interpreted that Ham's children were black or dark. There's a whole thread even within our tradition about that. And therefore, since they were cursed, even if they were created in the image of God, God gave them to us as a lower level of humans. That's how it was interpreted, so that they could be seen as slaves, right? Not that they were beasts, but that they were cursed by God. In a sense, it's what Christianity used against us by saying that when God gave the New Testament, or actually gave Jesus, he rejected us, called supersession, that Jesus superseded the earlier covenant that we were covenanted with God. And therefore God cursed us. And part of the curse was to be subjected to Christianity, to be outcasts, to be excluded, to be wandering Jews. So in a sense, it's a similar kind of thing of the notion that when God curses a people, they can be treated as less than human. Okay.
But why did he,
Rabbi?
Gail.
why did Jesus, I'm curious, why did Jesus think that you get rid of God? Is that what you're saying? And he then becomes the Son of God, or someone that they would go to first?
No. First of all, it wasn't really, if you read the New Testament, Jesus doesn't claim to be God. There are others who claim that he is the Son of God, but the phrase Son of God was also used in Jewish sources, but it wasn't used as a deity. It was used that I am a son of God, you are a daughter of God. But it got used that he was actually a manifestation of God.
Right.
That was really later. We believe Paul, who had been born as Saul and then converted and became Paul. And then later, Christian theology developed that Jesus was a manifestation of God. And there were three manifestations of God: God the Father,
The Son,
the Son, and God the Holy
Ghost, Spirit,
or Holy Ghost. But they were all one. And if you ask, how did that work, that they could be three and one at the same time? It's called the mystery, the holy mystery of God. There's no human explanation for it. God manifests God's self in this way. Judaism argues God has no physicality. God is always God. God is one, and that God is the same, and that all human beings are created in the image of God. So it was a different philosophy. Okay.
And in 28, when it says, and fill the earth and subdue it.
Right.
I think it's part of our problem today. If I own a lot of oil fields, I'm going to make it work for me.
Well, it is, our problem is that human beings are not God, We may be in the image of God, but we don't have foresight. You know, if you think back about energy, they were harvesting whales for oil.
Mhm.
And they were over harvesting whales for oil in the 19th century. Now, in the biblical days, they used olive oil.
Ah, okay.
Olive oil is a natural oil, and you can grow olives every year. They can continue to grow. So when you press the olives, it's a very laborious process, but it is renewable.
Mhm.
And as long as you can grow olives, you can use that as oil. Now we know today you can make oil out of lots of things. But when they discovered whale oil, it glowed very well, it burned very well, and therefore human beings went after the whales. And we began to deplete the whale populations.
Mhm.
At that same time, they discovered coal. Coal also was plentiful,
Mhm.
didn't know that it had negative, repercussions.
Right.
And then oil was discovered in the ground. And again, it was readily available, and we didn't know it was going to pollute the world. Just, there are all of these things. We were using the world, which God told us to.
Mhm.
We didn't know that we were also harming ourselves and the world.
Mhm.
However, once we find that out,
We have to do something.
we should be adjusting and moving in a direction, because we now know that we have other means to energize the world, right?
Mhm.
Without harming. We have wave power, we have wind power, we have solar power, we have even nuclear power. There are ways to control energy that doesn't harm necessarily in the same way. But getting the world to shift, and you're right, when you own a field of oil, or you're a company that makes oil, or you own stock in oil or coal, it's hard for you to give that up.
Right.
And so you're going to hold on, and enough people have enough power that they're holding on, that the people that see the change needs to happen are pushing. But that's what happens in the process. The hope is that we will make the shift in time. Humanity's been really good about it so far, but we're also, hitting some very, very difficult moments. And I don't know that any of us on this call will live to see the year 2100. I doubt it. So the fact is, we probably won't see whether humanity saves itself from the cataclysmic kind of predictions that some are making. But we have it within ourselves to do it.
Mm.
We need to muster the political will.
Mhm.
Okay, you want to go on?
Sure.
Okay. Source 2, from the same book, Genesis, but chapter 9.
Do you want me to read, or somebody else is
Please,
reading?
Gail, go ahead.
And surely your blood of your lives will I require. From every beast will I require it. And from the human being, even from every person's fellow, will I require the life of the human being. Wow.
Go on.
One who sheds a person's blood, by human beings shall their blood be shed. For in the divine image did God make the human being.
Okay, this is talking about now what happens when you kill a human being. If a human being is created in the divine image, what is the penalty for killing a human being? Now, the first one is God seems to say that God's going to require that each beast be accountable for killing other beasts. I don't want to deal with that right now, because we're focusing on our ethics with humanity. But from a human being, if you kill, that God's going to require blood of your lives for killing and taking another human being, right? So when you shed a person's blood, your blood gets shed, because human beings are created in the image of God, and you have to forfeit your own life for killing another. So this mitigates a little bit against the absolute notion of life, right? God has given us life, and we are created in the image of God. But when we kill another human being, we are forfeit our life.
I agree.
Rabbinical law will change that, and we're going to look at that. It will talk about what does that really mean. What does it mean to kill? What about accidental death? What about war? What about to protect yourself? Rachel, was your hand up?
It is. I
Okay.
didn't want to interrupt.
No,
I was
please.
asking, is this something that you could, or someone would say that the death penalty, that is okay?
Sure. Part of the argument you're going to see, I mean, the Torah is filled with death penalties. The question is, what
Is it ethical?
well, in Torah law, apparently it was ethical. Remember, if we examine their world, so the world of the Jews or the Israelites, because you could also decide, let's look at Egyptian law, or let's look at Babylonian law. But the Israelites, and this is our Torah, the Israelites were not permanent in any country until they conquered the land of Canaan. And even then, they didn't establish one united monarchy until under King David. So the question is, what did their courts look like? During the wilderness, they didn't have jails. They had no way. What do you do with someone who kills somebody? You're going to put him in chains? They didn't really have that. They didn't have the ability to deal with it. So killing someone, capital punishment, was a natural way to deal with maximum punishment. Later, when we were a settled people, the rabbis will change all of that and will look at it very differently. And basically, they will make it almost impossible to execute anybody, because they had prisons, or jails anyway. They had penalties, they had courts, they had a government, and they could function differently. We went through different periods. Does that answer, Rachel?
Yes.
Bobby?
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, isn't this where the eye for the eye, tooth for a tooth comes from?
Well, it's related to it, but it will actually say that in the book of Leviticus.
Yeah,
Say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But again, the rabbis, our interpretation of that will end up being that, just like the insurance companies, if you've ever taken out insurance and looked at insurance, you'll see if you lose a hand and a foot, this is how much your insurance policy will cover you. Have you ever seen this?
Yeah.
Insurance policies. If you lose an arm, this is how much you can be compensated. If you lose one eye, there are a lot of policies where they value different and the rabbis do the same thing. They say, if it's an eye for an eye, right? What if I am already blind in one eye and you damage the blind eye, but you have two good eyes?
Oh my gosh.
Well, think about real life. Or what if I'm left-handed and I damage your right hand and you are right-handed? Does that mean you damage my right hand, or because I damaged your right hand? Or do you damage my left hand because it's my dominant hand? This is all in the Talmud and the Mishnah. They discuss this because they're trying to figure out, what does it really mean? And they ultimately say, look, what if I only, I can't be exact in doing that. There's no way for me to do that. What if you are a carpenter, right? and I'm a middle management. My hand as a carpenter is much more important to me than your hand as middle management. You can function without that hand. I can't. So how do we value it? How do I penalize you by damaging your hand? So the rabbi said we have to put a price on it. Everything has to, just like the insurance companies did, everything has to have a value. And if I damage your eye, I have to pay you a certain amount of money. Gail?
So the Hartman, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So the Parkland trial is coming up. And I think the young man that killed 17 individuals
Right.
is pleading guilty. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, why do we take care of him for the rest of his life when he's taken the lives of 17 individuals? And then I say to myself, who am I to judge? He might come up with some phenomenal saving grace for the world. I don't know. But it's very hard to deal with.
Well, yes, capital punishment is one of those areas where you can argue, look, if you know, you can argue it any way you want. I think the view has generally been that originally capital punishment was a deterrent, that having that penalty was enough for people to not go out and kill other people. Now that we know from studies is not the actual result.
Right.
It doesn't, in fact, do that in society. There are many other factors. And because we now also understand about mental illness and we understand about abuse, we understand about the way people are shaped much more than they did, that to argue, I mean, I have no idea about this person and his mental capabilities. To say that someone who may have been deeply abused throughout his life and who was, you know, treated with nothing but violence and only knew violence, and then, you know, took it out on these people, should be executed. Well, maybe it would satisfy the families, and that might be enough. Maybe it would satisfy society, and that would be enough. But maybe it's worth the price to say we're going to pay for him to live out the rest of his life and maybe live with that. You know, the whole thing of the Sirhan came up for parole. And the Kennedys were mostly against it. Were some Kennedys who said they supported it. You know, I think capital punishment is a very, very difficult. There are certain ethical issues that there's no way to call them cut and dried.
Yeah.
Right. And certainly that's one. Anyone else who want to go on to the third source?
Okay.
That's so. Third source takes us to Deuteronomy, and now we're dealing with slavery, because the Torah does have slaves. They allow slavery under certain conditions. And they talk about slavery. And remember, part of slavery in ancient world had to do with two things. When you conquered a people, you had nowhere to put those people, right? You either had to live with the conquered people being around you and always a threat, or you had to expel them from their land so you wouldn't have them in your midst, or you had to kill them so they wouldn't take revenge on you for killing their families, or you could enslave them. Now, if you treated them decently as enslaved people, and that's what the Torah does, the Torah has rules about how you must treat a slave. And it's very specific about it, and the rabbis are very clear. Now, eventually the rabbis outlawed slavery. But remember, they lived in a different society. There were different conditions. But in the Torah, they do allow slaves. So here we have the case of a slave and how do you treat a slave? This is a little bit of it. So we have another reader that wants to take over this.
Oh, you shall not deliver to one's enslaver a slave who is saved from their enslaver with you.
Now, remember our laws in America. In America, we passed a law that said that the people could actually hunt in the areas that outlawed slavery, in the states that outlawed slavery, and could hunt for an escaped slave and drag them back. And that you as a citizen were required to give them up. And yet here in Deuteronomy, in the Old Testament, in our Torah, it says you may not do that. If someone has escaped, you may not deliver them up.
So, Rabbi, how, I mean, obviously, I know this is way past Genesis, but the areas where you said the Torah was allowing slavery, how far before this did that happen? I don't understand. I know this is like a hypothetical sort of, but I don't know how we got from everybody being created in the image of God to being allowed to own people.
Well, right, because you have the theory, which is all people are created in the image of God. That's the theory. That's our aspirational ethic.
Okay.
But then we have reality, right? We have reality. Let's take this. If you live in a society like England, at least used to be, where the police don't carry guns, right? And you had to petition through the process to have police have guns for certain kinds of situations. You don't have a lot of killings, right? In those days, there weren't a lot of police shootings or people shooting police, right? And if you watch the British shows with police, various shows, they don't normally carry weapons. Now, in America, which is filled with hundreds of millions of guns, and the police have to be armed to protect themselves and the citizenship, we have shootings every day. And of course, we've been having a lot of shootings of police officers, but also killings by policemen of others, because we live in a different reality. So if you think of it that way, there's the aspirational ethic, all people created equal, and then there's the reality. So when we were in the desert and when we were in our early days as a nation, we had certain realities, and slavery was treated in a certain way. But by the time of Deuteronomy, we already were a more settled people, and we were seeing enslaved people in a different way. And we were looking at slavery in a different way. There's an evolution going on in the law. Now, the Orthodox would not say that, but I'm saying that that's the way the law seems to me, and that's the way scholars usually look at it. Does that answer it, Kathy?
So what would the Orthodox say?
They would say God gave all this at the same time, that God gave it all on Mount Sinai, and it actually is one thing, and the separation of books is arbitrary. It's something that happened that the rabbis that were done later, but it's all one law.
Okay.
They also argue that the Mishnah and the Talmud is all one law with the Torah.
Okay.
Given by God at Sinai.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so let's look at 17. Kathy, if you would, please.
They shall dwell with you among you in the place which they shall choose within one of your dwelling places. Where it is good for them, you shall not wrong them.
Now, I'm going to read this slowly with us. This is about the enslaved people who ran away. So here, an enslaved person, right, runs away, comes to you and says, help me. You are not allowed to return first, that enslaved person, right? Well, look further you have to do for that person. Because you happen to be the one who saved that person, because that's who they came to you. You can't just say, get away from me. I don't want to have anything to do with you. First, you can't return the person. Next, that person must live with you. You must put that person up. Secondly, in a place which they shall choose within your dwelling places. They get to choose. They could choose the master bedroom, Joni said. No, but it has to be the way the rabbis interpret it. It has to be acceptable to them. You have to give them a place to live that is acceptable to them. They can say, the bed is a straw bed. I really want, a Simmons mattress. I want a little better. I mean, there's a limit to how demanding they can be, but you have to, in effect, save them. This is a slave that's run away. And you were not the one who enslaved him, but you're responsible because that one came to you. And then it says, it has to be what's good for them, and you shall not wrong them. You cannot abuse them. You cannot harm them. You must treat them like a human being. That's a pretty powerful statement when we're talking about an enslaved person who has run away. And considering the way slaves in this country were treated up till through the Civil War, and the way slaves are still treated in many countries in the world that has slavery. And this is, we're talking about 2,500 years ago. So, but what it does is, getting back to Gail's statement, yes. Getting back to Gail's statement, so we have the ethical statement, right, which is aspirational, created equal, male and female, everybody. Then we have we get to subdue the earth, and we can eat the animals. And then we get to what happens when one human being kills another human being, and there's a penalty there. And then we have this notion of slavery, where you have to treat a runaway enslaved person as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
So each one of these is a way of trying to define how do we deal with the real life situation and the ideal. And you can't live the ideal, but you can aspire to it. These are steps of aspiration, how to at least mitigate against the cruelty, because the assumption is that the person who ran away because it was unbearable. They didn't expect to be free. This is an enslaved person in a world where people are not free. We're talking about biblical world. There wasn't an idea of freedom like we have, but they came to you, and now you must treat them with dignity and with respect and give them a comfortable life. That doesn't mean you can't make them work. You can't make them slaves, but they can earn their bread. They can work in the fields. They can work with the sheep like you, right? It doesn't mean that they get a free ride because they've come to you as slaves. They're not your slave, but they are also not free totally. Okay, let's go to the last one, because this is the longest, and I'm going to read it. It's from the Mishnah. And now we're dealing with the rabbis trying to deal with capital cases. And they start by saying, how did they admonish witnesses in capital cases? We're talking about the judges. This in Jewish law, there are no lawyers. There are only judges. Right? It's not adversarial. There's a panel of judges. And the judges, there could be 3 judges, there could be 5 judges, there could be 23 judges. Depends on the case. Actually, in a capital case, there were usually 23 judges. And you had to have a majority at least of 2 in the voting. But it's much more complicated than that. So how do they admonish the witnesses in a capital case? So here's the situation. Somebody killed somebody and the witnesses came forward. You have to have at least 2 witnesses. They came forward. They stand in front of the judges. And this is what the judges say to them. They brought them in and admonished them and said, perhaps you will say something that is only a supposition or hearsay or secondhand or even from a trustworthy person. Or perhaps you do not know that we shall check you with examination and inquiry. Know, moreover, that capital cases are not like monetary cases. In monetary cases, a person may pay money and so make atonement. But in capital cases, the witness is answerable for the blood of who is wrongfully condemned and the blood of their would-be descendants in the world to come. This is what they're saying to the witness. If you give false testimony, if you even relate something that you didn't directly see yourself and saw and understand that you heard it from someone else, if you do that, you are responsible. Your blood is answerable for the condemned and their descendants that could have come from them, your would-be descendants, meaning even if they have no children. They might have had children, and you'll be answerable in the world to come for the children that should have been born of that person that you condemned. Now, that's pretty strong stuff. What? Wrongfully condemned, right? And then they're going to tell where they derive this from. For so we found when Cain murdered his brother, first murder, right? They go right back to the first murder of a human being with another. They're not really worried about them being brothers. They're looking at the murder. It says there, the damim, the bloods of your brother cry out. It doesn't say dam, which is singular. It says it in the plural. The bloods of your brother cry out. It doesn't say the blood of your brother, but the bloods of your brother, meaning his blood and the blood of his descendants. And then there's also said, another saying is, the bloods of your brother, that his blood was cast over trees and stones. Therefore, humanity was created in a world first as an individual. So they're saying that the blood of Abel spewed out over nature. And so you also, if you condemn someone wrongfully, it's as if you are implicating nature itself, and you will be answerable for that. So then they turn to why humanity was created as one person, Adam, right? Singular, Adam. To teach that if any person caused a single life to perish from Israel, they are deemed by Scripture as if they had caused a whole world to perish. And anyone who saves a single soul from Israel, they are deemed by Scripture as if they had saved a whole world. And then the reverse. Again, with a single person was created for the sake of peace among humankind, they're going to go through why a single person. So you see that it says with Israel, meaning a Jew. Why do you think it says a Jew?
Different rule if it's not a Jew?
Joni said because it's a different rule if it's not a Jew. No, you have to remember where they were.
Oh, there.
This was written under the Roman Empire. They had no control over the court.
I'm on a
Right.
Zoom with Rabbi. So can I call you back in a few minutes?
Oh, Gail.
They had
Gail,
no control
over
over the
capital-
Rome,
the Romans had it, which means the only ones they had control over were
the
Jews.
Jews, right? Okay.
They
So
couldn't-
that's why.
Couldn't be a Roman because
Right.
the Romans had control, or the Greeks had control, or the Babylonians had control, but they were not a sovereign nation. So the rabbis are only dealing with Jewish law, and that's assuming they could even carry it out. Very often they weren't allowed. If you remember in the New Testament, where is Jesus tried? He's tried in a Jewish court and then in a Roman. After the Jewish court, he's Roman. He's condemned by Pontius Pilate in a Roman court because the Romans are over the Jews and they have the right. And there's the moment where Pontius Pilate, if you remember the story, you may have seen the movie if you didn't read the book. Pontius Pilate can free one prisoner and he frees Barabbas and not Jesus. Well, all of that is Roman law. None of that is Jewish law, right? So here it's about Jewish law. So we're coming to the end. So I want to skip down to the last 5 sentences. And if perhaps you witnesses would say, why should we be involved with all this trouble? We're going to keep our hands out of it. We didn't see anything. We don't want to tell you anything. Why should we have to worry about all this stuff? It says, and now he gives a quote from Leviticus, they being a witness, whether they have seen or known, if they do not speak it, then they shall bear their iniquity. Meaning God will call you on it. You have to be a witness if you were a witness. You don't get to step out just because it's onerous, right? And if perhaps the witnesses would say, why should we be responsible for the blood of this person? Was it not said, when the wicked perish, there is rejoicing? Meaning, if you do it right, God rejoices in the fact that you carried out justice. So all are created equal. There is an issue of when someone takes a life. It's mitigated about witnesses, but you have to be very careful about how you condemn somebody. So all of this is a way of saying that the ideal ethics and the reality often present conflicts that we have to work out. And Jewish law treats human beings as equal, but also deals with the reality of the world they live in. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So next week, we're going to deal with the law as it applies, the ethics as it applies, called covenantal ethics to our people. What do we owe other Jews? What kind of ethical treatment? Is it the same as anyone, or do we owe them something special, something different because we're part of the same chosen community, the covenantal community?
Wow, that's a hard question.
Well, these are all hard questions, Gail.
Oh,
That's why we're studying. So thank you all very much. I'm going to stop share and
you.
look at that. Nice. And
Good job.
thank you for coming.
Thank
And
you.
Pleasure.
see you next week.
Okay.
Thank you.